Isolation creates a kind of paralysis in people where they don't participate fully in society, if at all, where they feel they don't matter, nobody cares, that they live their lives outside of all circles of concern.
Growing up, I already felt that we are isolated. We people were living in the slums. My family, they came from a village. They came to look for a job in the city. They end up not getting that job, and they found themselves in a place called Kibera slums. So what happened is that when you find yourself in the slum, the system makes it you believe that this is where you belong. So first of all, as we talk about the social isolation, it's also get created in your mind, and you know that I am poor, this is where I am, and I will never make it.
If somebody feels like that, it's impossible for them to get on with the living of their lives. We can see around the world examples of societies in poverty that can't move out, and I would submit that one of the main reasons is that they no longer have the vision or the voice to be able to do that.
The most painful and the most characteristic examples of isolation in Bulgaria and the surrounding country can be found in the Roma community. They have 12, even more years of lower life expectancy than the majority in the countries. Isolation and integration are not just notions and sayings, and they are not about the institutions and about policies. All those things are about people.
If we talk about a country like Palestine, disabled people are mainly considered as burden, and they are looked down by the community members and even the family members. Though they have a lot of ambitions, a lot of good skills, and a lot of potential, they have the pain of being marginalized and the pain of feeling unequal with others.
It is the single most powerful source of the destruction of the human spirit, the stigmatizing of someone as being invalid, and the attempt through that stigma, either deliberate or not deliberate, to crush their spirit. And so frequently in the history of people with intellectual differences, the attempt has been successful.
When you're isolated, you develop a depression, and you wonder if you're worthy. And I thought at one point in my life that I wasn't worthy of a life. And that's when Special Olympics had one athletic meet in swimming. I went to the first track meet, and it was the first time in my life I didn't get teased. I came home and I looked at my mom. She says, "How was it?" I said, "Man, nobody called me names. Nobody was calling people names." I had the best time of my life. It was like a liberation. Sport was a vehicle that took me out of isolation.
I grew up in an abusive household, and I left home when I was 16, 17. And I heard someone talking about Kids Company and like, oh, they give you free money. I was like, oh, free money's great, yay. So I went down there, and someone who actually like genuinely cared. You could tell it just wasn't their job. Just actually having that relationship to model the rest of my relationships on was really important, because all the ones I had before were pretty abusive. Like the only way I think to like kind of combat social isolation and people feeling like they can't be connected with people is sustained love and care.
If isolation is within the house, outside it's more worse. So I feel that if you're isolated inside where you are coming from within your family, then it's more worse to be isolated outside. Love begins at home.
Where trust is built, connections are strengthened. We have data that it can work. And I do believe that the issue of isolation and the importance of social connectedness is becoming clear, and that inclusive partnerships as a strategy for solution are increasingly being looked at as a way to go.
That's where I think it really is about creating and supporting solutions that are driven by those people who have experienced that isolation. There's so much opportunity to really support things that are already happening, and that, you know, this is an incredible time for us to start working more collaboratively together.
You have to have a common vision about the journey you're going to take together. We should share a common understanding about how we're going to work together on this part of the year.
From someone who comes from Africa, we only think these things are happening in Africa, and we think in America and London, everything is on a silver platter. They don't have these issues. But the fact that now I'm aware that it's across the world, sharing what works, sharing what we've tried, how it has affected our communities, I think is a best practice to deal with the issues that we are facing.
We're seeing movement in a number of Eastern European countries where governments are committing themselves to moving people out of institutions. If you take the economic point of view, there are a lot of studies that show that institutionalization, locking up people with disabilities, is actually more costly than building and investing in community-based alternatives. And so at the end, if you look at it from a long-term perspective, it's actually a better investment for governments to really ensure that people have the freedoms that they have a right to and actually are part of the community.
I ended up spending 20 years of my life in war zones to help women survivors of wars. You can't just talk to them about the concept of hope and love. You've got to give tangible deliveries of them. And in this way, in that regard, financial talks becomes very immediate. The international community sometimes is not aware and between advocating for these values but not in the delivery of them. We don't want to mess with people's hope when they are vulnerable, because it's all what people have.
As I think about this notion of isolation, where isolation has been felt, has been, where there's instances, for example, when the state took children away, like my father, who were subjected to sexual and physical abuse, and whose efforts to sort of tear apart the fabric of family created trauma. You can be in the middle of a city or in the middle of a loving community and have feelings of deep isolation and real searing pain. And then the moment that you become aware of this is the moment you begin to talk about it, is the moment it begins to dissolve. And it feels like a cooling salve on a burning wound. And I believe this to be true about an individual, having experienced this myself. I believe it to be true of a family. I believe it to be true of a community. I believe it to be true of a country. And I believe it to be true for people more broadly, which is why going into those dark feelings of talking about the pain of isolation is so important.
Situations that are hopeless are the ones that are allowed to thrive in shadows. This is not one of those, because we're calling this out.